Since the start of the war in Ukraine, and especially after the victory of Donald Trump in the presidential elections, we hear more and more voices from the political right questioning the media narrative about Russia. Some are still critical of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but more commentators harshly critique the Ukrainian authorities and President Zelensky in particular, and some actually side with Russia. On the one hand, I can totally understand the annoyance and frustration of the American taxpayers witnessing billions of their hard-earned dollars sent to the proxy war in a country about the size of Texas on the other side of the planet, with a name most haven't even heard until the last 3 years. Even if I had my personal sympathies and felt bad about people suffering in war, living on the other side of the globe, I would definitely be much more concerned about my family, my own country's economy, and well-being. On the other hand, the great distance and even greater cultural gap make most Americans who are genuinely interested in international affairs misunderstand Russia, Ukraine, and what's going on in the region. The US, a country with the most economic, geopolitical and military influence and interest all over the world, cannot afford to be ignorant about the issues its competitors are directly involved in. So, what are the main misconceptions that the American right, that currently holds most of the executive, legislative power and probably cultural influence, has on Russia and Russian Christianity in particular? The first myth: Ukraine persecutes Christianity. I have addressed this issue in more detail in one of my videos. Historically, Ukraine was the Bible Belt of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union. When it comes to Christianity, Ukraine has always been more diverse and more religious on average than Russia. The land on the border between Orthodox Russia and Catholic and Protestant West, and the word Ukraine literally means on the edge, on the border. The country has been greatly influenced and infiltrated by all sorts of Christian communities. Ukraine nowadays has a great diversity of Christian churches, living in relative freedom of worship, at least before the war started. There are all sorts of Protestant churches: Baptist, Pentecostal, Adventist, Charismatic. There are Catholics, especially in the regions bordering Poland. There are Greek Catholics, a church with Eastern Orthodox liturgy but subject to Rome and the Pope. There are Jehovah's Witnesses and many others. At the same time, the majority of Ukrainians identify as Orthodox Christians. However, there are at least 3 big Orthodox churches, 2 of which currently contest canonicity. When it comes to persecution, the rhetoric refers to the legal and reputational struggles of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, formerly of the Moscow Patriarchate. This church became an autonomous daughter church of the Russian Orthodox Church after the collapse of the Soviet Union, under the headship of an ambitious Metropolitan Filaret. Filaret has been since excommunicated and is now the head of another church, not recognized by anyone. The active de-Russification and decommunization of Ukraine in the 1990s naturally made many Orthodox Christians unhappy with the church controlled by Moscow. After decades of competition between newly founded, merged and divided Orthodox churches, which I discuss in a separate video, in 2019 the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, with the support of then-President Poroshenko, gave a canonical status to the autocephalous OCU, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Naturally, this was not recognized by Moscow, and the Christian world is split over this rivalry. To make things worse and more complicated, after the start of the war in 2022, Metropolitan Onufriy, the head of the UOC, declared that the church no longer belongs to the Moscow Patriarchate, but is still the only canonical church in Ukraine. The Moscow Patriarch and his apparatus have up to this day only acknowledged the part about canonicity, while choosing to ignore the statement about leaving the Russian Church. For the last 3 years, the Patriarch and most of the church leadership have made numerous appeals to the canonicity of the UOC and the persecution she sustains, but never the declaration of parting ways with Moscow. During the last round of peace talks in Istanbul, the Russian delegation put the persecution of the UOC as one of the negotiation points. The leadership of the UOC, in turn, hasn't reacted to any of such statements so far. The UOC is in a big crisis. Many parishes and some eparchies are split over their obedience to Ukraine or Russia, especially in the areas occupied by the Russian military. Metropolitan Onufry is very undecisive. He gives strong statements but hardly makes any substantial decisions. Experts say it seems like he's waiting, either for the war to be over or for someone else to deal with the crisis, maybe even after his death, or even for a miracle to happen. The Ukrainian state recognizes the OCU as the canonical church. The people of Ukraine are split, and Moscow recognizes the UOC as canonical, but only as a part of the Russian Orthodox Church, which the UOC has already rejected. Now, when it comes to persecution, it does take place. It is, however, not as radical as the Russian and some right-leaning Western media portray it. Ukraine has not banned the UOC. See a video where I discuss exactly that. However, law enforcement applies tremendous pressure on the church, often grossly overreacting. The UOC is used as a scapegoat with a reputation as a Russian asset, especially without clear steps away from Moscow. When the voices on the right claim that the Ukrainian regime persecutes Christianity, it is simply factually incorrect. Yes, one can make a claim that Ukraine prosecutes one of the biggest Christian churches, but it only comes to the leadership, selected parishes, and the most expensive property. No lay person has been prosecuted for simply belonging to the church associated with Moscow. Whatever your view on canonicity, and no American right-leaning blogger or journalist is an expert in canon law, Ukraine is still one of the most Christian countries in Eastern Europe, much more religious on average compared to Russia. The second myth, actively spread by the American right, is that Russia is a conservative country and Putin is a Christian leader. Sadly, the ones who share these ideas are simply victims of Russian propaganda. If you watch the Russian media too much, you may believe this story. Let me, however, counter it with some simple facts. It is true that most Russians are traditional and socially conservative. Well, most of the second and third world is outside of the Western bubble. Most Russians value their national and ethnic culture, and these are often two different things in a multi-ethnic Russia. Their language, family, can tell a man from a woman, and the role of religion in society, even when they don't themselves believe in God. This conservatism naturally can go over the top, especially when it comes to LGBT people, who are persecuted more and more every year. At the same time, Russia is sadly too far from being a traditional conservative haven. Naturally, all countries, whether liberal or conservative by reputation, have some social issues and problems, but some of the numbers are just too striking even compared to other countries per capita. Abortion. In Russia, there are about 500,000 abortions per year. The number has significantly decreased since the 1990s, but Russia is still the world leader in abortions per capita. How conservative and traditional is that? Divorce. Russia is no longer the world leader as she used to be, but is still in the top 5 or even top 3 countries in the whole world, somewhere after the Maldives and Kazakhstan, and way above China and the US. Again, I'm not the one to judge the people who terminate their marriages, but is it very conservative or traditional? Russia also holds the second place in single-mother households globally. Orphans. There are around 400,000 orphans in Russia as of 2021, though most of them live in foster families. However, 40,000 orphans still live in orphanages. 60,000 children are homeless. Maybe the numbers do not seem so big compared to more than 140 million population, but how traditional and conservative is the country with 60,000 children living on the street? The icing on the cake is alcoholism, first mentioned in more than 1,000-year-old chronicles, the drug epidemic, and an undeclared HIV epidemic. Not very conservative and traditional to my taste either. As for religion, the Russian Orthodox Church claims up to 60-70% of the population, followed by a strong 10-16% of Muslims. However, especially when it comes to Orthodox Christians, the vast majority of them identify with this faith due to cultural and national tradition and only visit their local church once a year on Easter, if at all. Any criteria beyond this self-identification, such as church attendance, regular prayer, reading the Bible, or partaking of the holy sacraments, result in a dramatic drop in the percentage from 60-70 to about 3. When it comes to Putin's Christianity, you can see a separate video on the subject on my channel. In brief, his Christianity was only revealed when he assumed political power in the 2000s. Most Russian politicians claiming strong Christian faith nowadays were converted at some point in the 1990s, when Orthodox Christianity was regaining popularity after the Soviet state atheism. Putin's generation of politicians, now in their 60s or 70s, were all members of the Communist Party and were as actively promoting communism as they promote Orthodox faith nowadays. Putin was not just a party member, but a KGB officer. Due to the Cold War, the infamous Soviet secret police was one of the best secret services in the world. The selection process included a thorough background check, including not only personal connections, family backgrounds and loyalty, but also ideological convictions. Putin was a high-ranked officer serving abroad in Germany, thus a subject to even more detailed scrutiny. Current biographies of Putin and he himself claim that he has believed in God for all of his life and was seemingly baptized as an infant by the father of the current patriarch, Archpriest Mikhail Gundyaev. Recruiting a lifelong Christian believer to the position of a KGB officer serving abroad, especially when his appointment is not directly related to religion, would not just be unlikely, it would be a violation of security protocols. We don't know, and we could not know, what Putin thinks and believes deep in his heart. But one thing is certain: the role Orthodox Christianity plays in his life, and especially in decision-making, is grossly overestimated. If one follows the state propaganda a little bit closer, one can clearly see how much bigger a role the cult of the victory in the Second World War plays in the state ideology, especially in anti-West rhetoric and the war in Ukraine. The third myth is probably the most dangerous of them all. Some right-wing influencers may leave you with an impression that Russia is on their side, flirting with the idea that Putin might be a good guy, and if the competent nationalist government finally comes to power, Putin will be the closest ally against wokeness, the European Union and NATO, or maybe even against China. Most of such speculations are just immature and show an evident lack of understanding of the international situation. Anyone who has read Machiavelli or simply uses common sense comprehends that all political allies are situational, and every major political power is only interested in its own benefit. The media often analyzes major political decisions from the standpoint of social justice, peacemaking, international relations, and so on. This is very naive. The world leaders might not always be concerned with the happiness and well-being of their populations, but definitely with their loyalty, support, and potentially votes. one should not be surprised that a decision made in one part of the world might not be welcomed in another. It's good to have empathy, but it should not reshape our priorities so that we neglect our own families and countries so that someone else on the other side of the planet suffers a little bit less. It might sound cynical, but it is true. So, what is the problem with the American right's understanding of Russia? The major issue is that it is too simplified, shaped in the black and white categories, and hence heavily impacted by propaganda. One of the major points I always make on this channel is that Russia and Russian Christianity in particular are way too complex to perceive in such a way. It has the good, the bad, and the ugly, and if the American right wants their analysis to be taken seriously, they should embrace the complexity of anything Russian and maybe do a little bit more research before offering their opinions. Please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you all next time.